Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cristina Pérez, one of the members at large of the Poe Studies Association, and I am the organizer of this panel, which is Poe in the Wireless Classroom. We're going to have 4 speakers today. Our first speaker will be Susan Amper. Susan is a professor of English at the City University of New York. In addition to articles on Poe, Susan has published on Vladimir Nabokov, James Baldwin, Flannery O'Connor, and many others. She also contributes articles on Poe, crime and mysteries, to the blog Criminal Element. And the title of her paper is going to be Why Finding Poe for Millennials and Beyond.
I want to give you a little bit of background on my college and the students who attend. I teach at the largest urban university in the country, the City University of New York. My campus, we have 25 campuses. Mine is Bronx Community College. And if you're familiar at all with the area, it's near the Bronx Zoo and Fordham and the Botanical Gardens. And was until 1973 NYU's Uptown campus. It is also the only community college in the US designated as a National Historic Landmark. That's because of these 3 beautiful buildings, and one of them you probably can't see because the speakers are in the way. But the one in the center is Gould Memorial Library. These were designed by Stanford White, a famous architect. Also something of a pervert, but that's for another day. The Gould Memorial Library is perhaps the most beautiful building in the Bronx. And if you ever get a chance to see it, inside it's just spectacular. It is also about a mile from Poe's last home at Fordham. So I can often actually take students there when the weather is nice, and we'll just walk over. One of the more interesting structures on the campus is the Hall of Fame for Great Americans. This was the brainchild of Henry Mitchell McCracken, who was the NYU chancellor. Also designed by Stanford White. These are all pictures of the Hall of Fame. The one in the middle is at the back of the campus. So if you were standing on the street down below or on the riverside, that's what you would see. And I know you probably think big deal Hall of Fame. Everywhere you turn, there's a Hall of Fame, right? It's baseball, music, firefighters, crop dusters, Barbie, and cowgirls. I kid you not. And hundreds of others. But the one here in the Bronx is the very first Hall of Fame in the country. And at one time, it was a very, very big deal. It was a truly democratic institution. Anyone could nominate a candidate. People could write into the newspaper. NYU served as steward, raising funds and running the elections. And it was technically the property of the American people. That was the intention. And people took it very seriously. Newspaper publishers used their editorial pages. The American Bar Association, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, they all waged extensive campaigns for their candidates. And then it was up for a vote. For a while, the term Hall of Famer carried great cachet. And the hilltop in the Bronx, this is actually the highest point in the Bronx where the library is, to many the highest spot in the country, if not the world. And honestly, all of this buildup is just so I can give you this next bit, where Bronx Community College and the Hall of Fame fit in I want to say pop culture. Sorry. And here is Poe's bust by sculptor Daniel Chestnut French, who among other memorials designed the Lincoln Memorial. But this is the very first mention of a Hall of Fame in the culture, and it comes from The Wizard of Oz. So that's kind of fun. At least it is for me. Let me provide some demographics of the college and the students who go there. We are mostly Latino students, and I will say, if you happen to have seen the Broadway play or the movie In the Heights, you get sort of a microcosm of our students. That would be in Washington Heights, which is north of Harlem, but south of where I am in the Bronx. 55% of them are first generation college students. Almost half of them have ESL as a second language, and 60% of them work more than 20 hours per week. And the final statistic here is that 73% of the students at the college live below the poverty line. So that creates a number of issues when I'm teaching. For one thing, I no longer use textbooks in the class. Everything is either open educational resources or somehow free. I don't charge them for textbooks. And now, when I started a class on Poe some years ago, this used to be how I started it. I went with this. I would give out this page with 10 questions on it and say, okay, just take a minute and write true or false next to each one, and then we'll have a discussion. And then what I got was this. People saying, Professor Amber, who is Edgar Allan Poe? And I thought, oh, all right, let me take a step back here and rethink how I want to approach this. So I said, let me give you a brief intro so that you would get into Poe. And I said that some people thought he was a complete nut job and that he wrote weird stories, the insane products of a deranged mind. But I explained he was an ordinary man, except that he had a passion for literature and sometimes for alcohol that went far beyond anything that had ever existed in America up until then. He also probably had the worst luck of any writer in history. Starting when he was a baby, sorry about that, and ending, well, not even ending at his death, even after his death, when Rufus Griswold, a man who it turned out was truly deranged by some twist of fate, became Poe's literary executor, as you all know. But the reason I mention it is that now, with my students who don't really know Poe, I find that Griswold's letters are a good place to start with them. These are all available online. And so I start with asking students to read the letters and to write down what has been changed, why they think it's been changed, what that says about Griswold. And my students, being a lot smarter than Griswold, realize right away that he's trying to make himself look good and make Poe look bad. And so they get a little sense of the controversy going on in Poe's life at the time. After that, as I say, because students aren't that familiar with Poe, I asked them to look at poestories.com at home and to go through each of the categories and write something. And we have a small writing assignment for it. And it gives them more of an overall look at Poe. Some of them have heard of Poe, of course, through pop culture references, but they don't know anything about his writing or necessarily his life. Before I talk more about studying Poe with the students, I want to address one of the biggest hurdles facing them at BCC, Bronx Community. The university, to its everlasting shame, has done away with virtually all ESL and developmental programs, farming them out to places where they are taught by people who are not teachers. So students come not prepared for college when they come into a classroom. And one of the things that they are particularly worried about is writing. They find it very hard, and I'd say, newsflash, everybody finds it hard. I said, I'd rather dig a ditch than write an essay, but I also tell them that writing is a skill, one that they can learn, like learning the piano or ice skating or baseball. But I know that it worries them, it worries all students, but to ease some of their anxiety, I let them use 2 editing sites before they have to hand in a paper to me. And the key ingredient for both of these is that they are free. The first one is called the Hemingway app, too bad. And it's pretty much as you see here. A student can write right on this page or cut and paste their essay here. And the essay will then be highlighted in these different areas. The colors here are which you can't see because the speakers are up, explains what those issues are, whether the sentence is too long or too complicated, whether they might use another word. And students get an opportunity to change their paper based on these suggestions. And it makes them less anxious for handing in an essay if they think it's been looked at with a more professional eye. The other one is called SlickWrite, also free. Similar type of annotation site. I ask the students to use both, choose whichever one they want to use. That's up to them. And when we finally get to reading Poe, after we've taken care of some of the anxieties, I use the Mabbott edition of Poe that's online, thanks to Jeffrey Savoy. And we read 3 or 4 stories. These are community college students, and I can give them only so much. I also offer an audio version of every story for them, and these 2 are free. They can get them from LibriVox, I get them. Project Gutenberg, sometimes from Audible, and those students find helpful because they are challenged by Poe's writing, his voice. So when they read the story, they listen to the audio at the same time, and they have found that very, very helpful. Also, I have noticed that Poe's stories are excellent for teaching close reading. It's another skill that many students do not have. And one of the tools I use for this is Hypothesis. It's an online annotation tool that it allows users to annotate right on the web, on news articles, online journals, and it works a little bit. Where'd I go? Okay, I don't know how that happened. I might highlight a text here, any piece of text, and down here I would ask them a question, and then students would then annotate it or answer the question. And I might get something that looks like this. You'll see all of these highlighted lines of text. Some of them are by one student, some of them are highlighted by several students. And on the right are the students' comments. And it's a way for them to engage with the text. It also helps them to engage with each other because they can talk to each other about what their comments are in whatever text it is we're reading. There are other annotation sites, but as I said, I like Hypothesis. I like it because it's free, but I also like it because of my learning management system. As I mentioned, I give them an audio version, I give them the short story, and I don't think you can see this, it's behind people's pictures. The Hypothesis is fully integrated into the LMS. That means that it comes right from within. Our learning management system is Blackboard. So students don't have to go outside of Blackboard to find anything for the class. Sometimes when they need to do that, they kind of don't or wander off. So I try to make their ability to get to the texts as easy as possible. Now, after we've read some stories and done some annotation, I like them to look at some primary documents. And I use the site Nevermore, which is a collection of Susan Taine's documents. And there are quite a number of them there, and they're very fun to look at. So students get a chance to see primary documents, which include playbills of shows that his parents were in, reviews of Poe's works, handwritten poems that Poe wrote, even pages from some of the journals he edited. So we choose 1 or 2 of these to look at and analyze. And one of the tools I use for that is the Library of Congress Teacher's Guide, an analysis tool. You can see here I've got primary sources, but on the left, it's got all of these: motion pictures, newspapers, oral histories, etc. It has helpful tools for all of those things if you wanted to look at it and see if it would help your students. The National Archives has something similar. It has a number of educator resources that you can use in your classroom with your students. Last year, I was excited to start a project with Wiki Education. And this was for Poe. We had started the class. what was really excellent about it is, as you can see here on the left, how to edit, evaluating, finding your article. The students have to go through several modules before they can actually start to write an article. And they learn literacy skill, research skills, their writing skills. When they know that they're writing for actually the whole world, rather than just maybe me, they tend to be a lot more careful with their writing. However, due to the pandemic, in March, this was an assignment I had to ditch because most students don't have computers at home, and they tend to do their work on their phones, unbelievably. But this was not a project I thought could be handled well on a phone. So I decided I would have to try it another time, and then I went on sabbatical for the year. So this was the start of mine. I was in a 19th century American literature class, and we were going to start this project for the final 10 weeks of the class. As I said, that didn't work out, but it is my plan to start that again here in the fall of this year, so that students get some background on Poe and primary documents, and then they get to play around with Wikipedia, which is a lot of fun. And also I tell them, bonus points for anybody who corrects the spelling of Edgar Allan Poe's name on the web, where it is wrong in so many places. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I think we will leave all the questions for the end. So when all four presenters have finished, we can ask the questions that you have. And now our second speaker comes all the way from Brazil. His name is Helciclever Barros da Silva Sales. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. He's at the National Institute for Educational Studies and Research-Anísio Texeira, and he will be presenting the Raven Online mapping reprints, as well as literary and artistic translations over the internet. So whenever Helciclever, you can share your screen if you want.
Yes. Good afternoon. Greetings from Brazil. I want to try to expose some brief reflections on the most famous poem in the world. I would like to thank you for the honor of participating in this event. I am certainly the least experienced researcher in this panel. Special thanks to Professor Cristina and to the entire organization of this conference for the opportunity to be with today. I apologize in advance for my limited English. Can I show my presentation now, Professor? Yes. Well, I'm going to show the presentation slides, but I'm going to concentrate, as a matter of time, on reading synthetic text about my research. I would also like to highlight the obvious, the wonderful potential of the new possibilities for literary studies that the internet has provided, with the increase in the databases and processes for digitizing work around the world. This is, and in analogy to statistical research, providing the development of literary meta-analysis studies, a fertile ground for mapping, data mining, and the establishment of new analytical relationships, especially for comparative literary studies. The many historical publications of prose poem in compendiums of rhetoric and eloquence, in addition to so many other didactic publications, demonstrate, however, the last few centuries, this work by Poe has been an obligatory presence in the literary formation of several generations. In the internet age, post-poetic text has also been widely used to compose script and aesthetics proposals for short films, plays, musicalizations, among other artistic compositions, with pedagogical purposes. There are many publications on YouTube with these characteristics. This occurs both because of the aesthetic and narrative possibilities of the poems The Raven, and because of the fact that Poe's work in the public domain. This is in analogy to statistical research provided the development of literary meta-analysis studies. Based on the current research tools, it was possible to collect a series of bibliographic data and other information related to Edgar Allan Poe's poem in various media and artistic domains from the past and today. Now, I'm going to highlight just a few more slides. The first set of slides synthesizes some important dialogical relationships that Poe's poem has established over time with other arts and artists, particularly in film, theater, and drama, music, painting, and other visual arts. There is also a schematic proposal for the pedagogical elaboration of literary mappings with students with the support of digital tools and the internet. Next, there is a chart that highlights the distribution of literary translations of the poem in various countries. There is also a slide containing the 10 countries that most translated the poem, considering all the quantitative or not necessarily the aesthetic aspect of the translation. Brazil occupies the first position in this list. Final considerations. There is the Raven's translation around the world. There is the distribution of translation of the Raven by Edgar Allan Poe by countries. There is the countries that most translated the poem, The Raven, the top 10. The Raven seems to be, although more comparative studies are needed, the most translated modern poem in the world, having been poured into other languages at least 700 times. The Raven seems to be the second most musicized poem. The Raven seems to be one of the most translated or transposed poem for cinema and other audiovisual experiences, especially short films. The Raven seems to be of the most visual poem in the history of literature. The Raven was probably one of the most popular modern poems that circulated in US newspapers. The Raven seems to be one of the most parodied and paraphrased modern poems in literary history. The poem The Raven, from a pedagogical and epistemological point of view, opens windows for teachers to explore with their students various artistic domains in an interdisciplinary perspective. This poem is therefore a very rich guiding treat to explore mysteries and whenever new opportunities for school learning. Thus, when searching for information and analysis about the poem The Raven, the internet user can get to know more and better the production of several artists who dialogued with Poe's texts. I will to show some slides with the databases. There is the Raven translation and reprints, some information. The Raven and other arts with numbers of transpositions. The Raven, the music, some singers and bands. The Raven in the theater, with directors and playwrights. The Raven, the moves. The comics. In the visual arts. In dramatic reading. There is the Teach Sham proposal for online literary interactive and intermediate mappings. There is the analysis and conclusions, brief conclusions. Final consideration. That is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helciclever. So now we are going to go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Les Harrison from Virginia Commonwealth University. And he's going to speak today about editing Poe in the digital humanities classroom.
Okay, so hello, I'm Les Harrison, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of English at Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, located in Richmond, VA. I want to start today by saying a few things about my school and our typical students. I'll try to go quick on that. And then I want to focus on the efforts or the evolution of my efforts to bring editorial theory and practice into the Poe classroom. So VCU, we're an urban public research university located in the heart of Richmond, Virginia. While our promotional materials proclaim that we were founded in 1838, the current iteration of the university was actually founded in 1968, when Virginia realized that somehow they had neglected to put a public college in their capital, and bolted together Richmond Public Institute, Professional Institute with Medical College of Virginia. That's kind of a liberating thing, the fact that we don't have 200 years of traditions making us do and not do certain things. We have a current undergraduate enrollment of about 22,000. We grew a lot from the 90s into the early aughts. Like everybody else, we've slowed down a bit over the last 10 years. A large number of our students are first generation, nowhere near as many as at Susan's institution. But we do have a fair number. Like Susan as well, we're a Poe location. Undergraduates, as you all know, are generally receptive to Poe. Most having read some of his works in high school. The fact that we're located in Poe's hometown encourages an even greater interest in Poe among our students. From almost any classroom on campus, a 30-minute walk, 20-minute bus ride will take you to any one of the locations in which Poe lived in the city. All of his homes with the Allans, all of which have been destroyed. The former location of the Southern Literary Messenger offices on the corner of 15th and Main, also destroyed. And then the site of the monumental church, which was built to memorialize the Richmond Theater fire of 1811, which one of those great moments in reading Quinn's biography is where you can feel him wishing that Elizabeth had died in that fire and that she just missed it by a month. But that's an available site and we can go there and see the crypts. Okay, so let me see if I've got this right. The other thing to say, let me see, do I have that there? I tried to integrate everything into the notes. Okay, so one of the things that got me into Poe and the digital text, digital editing, by inclination, I am a little bit of a digital humanist or digital humanities scholar. I've worked on some projects on Melville and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I'm working on an edition of Tamerlane and other poems. A particular note for Poe, though, is the way in which the internet's modern culture of reprinting leads to a hyperabundance of Poe texts, and how this hyperabundance becomes reflected by my students, or is reflected in my students' classroom practice. As anyone who has taught 19th century American literature in the last 15 years notes, it is incredibly hard to get undergraduate students to use the texts you want them to use. Why? Because everything in the 19th century is available for free online between Hathi, archive.org, and Gutenberg. And I don't blame them. They're sitting there looking at an expensive college book and they're saying, but that's available online for free. It's a fairly obvious choice for them to make. While this can sometimes be a problem, right? You know, the students, the big problem, of course, is when the student says, hey, my text doesn't say this, which is actually kind of an interesting moment. It also represents an interesting opportunity to bring up topics of textual production, revision, and transmission. And here, my first effort to lean into the digital proliferation of Poe texts in the undergraduate classroom took place in a senior seminar on Poe I offered in the spring of 2017. And here I drew on the work of John Bryant's The Fluid Text. A number of you are probably familiar with this work. I would say in the last 15 years, it's gotten a lot of discussion in terms of thinking about how online archives can move beyond paper. What I've got on the screen here is a page image from the Longman Critical Edition Fluid Text Moby Dick. And the way Fluid Text, I'll quickly rehash Fluid Text for the couple of you that might not be familiar. The idea of Fluid Text editing is that you want to highlight the moments where the text has been edited or revised. Before I even get to Moby Dick, the simplest one would be, I would love to see the Northern Anthology print Thanatopsis with a clear line that shows, hey, these lines were added later, right? Because that's an important thing for the students to understand when they're reading that poem. In this example of Moby Dick, and this is regular page rather than digital, what they've done is things that got stricken from the American version when it became the British version are done in gray bold type, so they pop. If they're worth discussing, the editors accompany it down on the bottom with a discussion of why this got taken out. The best chapter in this Moby Dick is where the students realize that nothing was changed in, let's say, Queequeg and Ishmael sleeping together, except for, a blasphemous statement. Find that they're, now married and rolling around in bed. Not so fine for Melville to say that there is no God and modern religion is a sham. And it helps orient the students to write what the cultural problem at the time was. How am I doing? Not that bad. All right. So, and bringing fluid text editing into the undergraduate classroom, my big goal at first, and particularly with my undergrads, was to make sure that technology wasn't a barrier. Our department currently, we do not have access to a production lab. We have one, but it's used in our PhD program, and it's very hard to get access to. The other thing is, and I think this might be familiar to Susan, is that a number of our students, if they do have a laptop, it's not a Mac or a PC, it's a Chromebook. which means that you can't have them buy any software because it simply won't run on their computer. Fortunately, even students working on their phones have access to Google Documents. And with Google Doc, you can do some basic layout. If you're not concerned about issues of semantic markup, right? If you just want to make the text look a certain way. And so what I had them do was, was a simple one of 3 assignments. It wasn't the major assignment in the semester. For this assignment, I limited the students to working with the lake, spirits of the dead, song, fairyland, or a dream, and asked that they take 2 witnesses of the poem and make a fluid text edition. And so we've got a student example. The black boxes are obviously me taking their name out. And so they give us, right, okay, they're discussing a dream. They're giving us a straightforward, this is the publication history. They're drawing pretty heavily on Jeffrey Savoy to get this information. After you get past that though, using, and I took 1 day with them because some of them are frightfully inexperienced with using Word as more than a typewriter, and show them how to either do double column or to hide a table to get 2-column text. And then, right, what they went through here is they used red to show additions. They did strikeout and gray to show deletions from the text. And they worked up a series of revision narratives along the side where they offered interpretation of what they thought was going on in the text. I've got another one over here. This is Spirits of the Dead. Title of the poem is capitalized, the dash is stricken. A note on how it eventually became, right, numbered stanzas. And then here's the bigger changes as they go through. I think this particular one is is the only student that actually realized they weren't limited by 8.5 by 11, because they submitted it digitally. Like, it was the one student that's like, I could use a different paper size, and actually rotated it around. So I then took this to a class I taught in the last semester of the before times, fall of 2019. I taught a graduate seminar on scholarly editing. What did I call it? Edgar Allan Poe and digital scholarly editing. And I had to change that title. It was originally Editing Poe, and I got a ton of override requests from our MFA students because they thought it was going to be literary editing, like to get published in a magazine. So I wanted to emphasize that this was going to be digital scholarly editing. The class met once a week, and for most weeks, we split our time between Poe text in the first half, and then editorial theory or the use of a specific digital tool set in the second half. And that might have been collation software. We actually took a whole class to learn TEI and XPath, a little bit of grep to do find and replace, mainly finds for them. For the final project in class, the students were tasked with making a full scholarly edition of a Poe tale or poem with a significant scholarly tradition. I was trying, some of them were, I could tell, were a little bit nervous about doing this. I didn't want them, running off to the Duc d'Omelette so that there would be no scholarship to deal with, or limited scholarship. The edition required both a general introduction and a textual introduction. A TEI encoded version of the work that recorded all witnesses and which used double endpoint attachment to note variant readings, and which included an apparatus. I'm going to switch my sharing going on here. So I'm going to stop, kill something, and then come back to sharing. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to kill this. And then I need to open something on my desktop for you to see. And I think the one I want to use is probably open with BB Edit, return on sharing, share screen, and we'll do basic. We'll share this one first. So what I've got on the screen right now is TEI. How many of you are familiar with TEI, have worked with TEI at all? What TEI is a near cousin of HTML. It works a lot like HTML, where you have tags that you use to bracket words. It's extensible, which means you can make up your own tags. So you see something that's familiar from HTML, look, paragraph begin, paragraph end. And we've got a block of Poe text. And then you've got things like, hey, look, there's a page break in here. So they're just coding this in TEI. The nice thing about TEI, and I made them buy the Oxygen editor, it was graduate students. I knew they would all have fully functional laptops. The nice thing about Oxygen is it will let them know with error codes whether or not they're doing it right or not. Now, this doesn't mean that much to you. What's really interesting about TEI is that it does a lot with metadata, and I'm up against it, so I will quickly show you the results of this person's, which look like this. Toggle one more, and I think I would maybe want to use all the Usher Web Archive. And we go back to that, and we share, and we go this. So what we've got here is they managed to put together a full edition. There is a nice 20-page introduction that I'm not going to bother to show you because it's a seminar paper. It's white screen, black text. So here they've got all their witnesses, and then it's footnoted throughout. And if you go to the bottom, what you get is a giant witness apparatus, obviously appropriate for graduate students and people that kind of get TEI, totally incomprehensible to undergraduates, which is another reason why I wanted to stay with Microsoft Word and the fluid text, because fluid text editions, the thing that's great about them is you don't have to know how to read an apparatus. It's right there on the screen, whereas graduate students tend to be footnote hounds, the good ones at least. All right, I'm right at it for 15, so I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you. Stop share.
Well, thank you very much, Les, for your presentation. Our last speaker is Lesley Ginsberg. Lesley is a professor of English at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, where, among other courses, she is grateful to teach an undergraduate seminar on Poe. She has published book chapters on Poe in American Gothic, New Interventions in a National Narrative, and in the MLA's Approaches to Teaching Poe's Prose and Poetry. In 2019, 2 works on Poe appeared, a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Edgar Allan Poe and an article in Poe Studies, both on Poe's letters. She is the recipient of the 2021 Letters, Arts and Sciences Outstanding Teaching Award Online Teaching category. So Lesley's presentation is entitled Teaching Poe with Digital Resources in 2021. So whenever you want.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you to Professor Pérez for organizing this. Thank you to Professor Armiento for doing the tech and the recording. I appreciate that ALA made this option available to us. And I appreciate everybody for being here today. And I feel like I've learned so much from the presenters already. I will share my screen, but thank you for bearing with my kind of boring slides. So let me do this, and I think I am sharing the right thing, which is here, and then I will move everybody so I can go to, let's see, start. There we go. So I hope that that is visible. If it isn't, let me know, and I do see a thumb up, thank you. And if it's not, if I run into problems or I start to go over time, just please just speak up and interrupt me, because I'm not seeing my clock at the moment. So what a difference a year makes. I had originally planned to present this paper about teaching Poe with digital resources in May of 2020 after submitting an abstract in early January of that year. In March of 2020, educators pivoted to remote teaching modalities in record time as the pandemic lockdowns began. I was relatively well positioned to do that in my courses, which are all undergraduate, traditional undergraduate face-to-face classes. because I do use our learning management system, which we switched a few years ago from Blackboard to Canvas. So that's what we're doing now. But there was so much to learn and so little time to learn it. Educators at all levels, all over the globe faced similar issues. The long wait times for the Canvas 24/7 hotline gave eloquent testimony to a national digital educational meltdown. And what seemed like a meaningful opportunity to present pedagogical strategies using digital resources in early 2020 looks very different more than a year later. I imagine that most of you here today could teach me a thing or two about using digital resources to teach Poe. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. And I apologize for sharing strategies that may seem commonplace now that we're all using digital resources in our teaching. So my paper today focuses on 2 classes in which I teach Poe with digital resources. The first is more or less of a survey class, and we call them breadth courses in our department. On American literature, 1820 to 1900, in which Poe is one of many featured authors. The course is designed for junior level English majors, and that's my welcome screen for it. The second class is a deep dive into Poe studies in a senior English seminar capstone major author class. I'll start with the breadth course, and I've been teaching iterations of that course for longer than I care to acknowledge. But in 2020, our library finally purchased the American Periodical Series online, and we had never had that before. And that was a game changer for me. That enabled me to offer a fully online class using APS, American Periodical Series, as well as several other open educational digital resources such as DocSouth and Google Books. I had been envisioning this course for years as a kind of fully online course in which students would also theorize a little bit about using the digital and what it meant to do that. Finally, I had the opportunity to offer it. But as I told my students, it wasn't because of COVID-19, it was because we had the resources to do it. I teach at a small regional comprehensive university. We do not have a rare book room where I can take my students. Actually, in some other classes, I've taken students to the rare book room at a local college that does have that kind of material, but we don't have that. So it's sort of the digital or whatever I happen to be able to scare up to show students. I was very excited to be able to offer digital access and to think a little bit about what it meant to be using digital facsimiles to discuss print culture. The course was about print culture in 19th century American. It would culminate in a research paper that placed 19th century American literary work in its print culture context. Because the course was about the digital, it made sense to teach it fully online, and it was just coincidental that it coincided with pandemic restrictions. Over the summer, I did take a class that our university offers for educators about how to teach online, and that was very useful for me, and I'm really grateful for that. And one of the things I really tried to do in my digital class, which was fully online, was to make sure that there was a community building kind of personal component to it, even though it was digital and remote. So I would do things like scaffold assignments from lower stakes to higher stakes to get students interested in using digital resources. And one of the most important events that we had, which was in the second week of the class, was I partnered with a librarian at our library, and we did a workshop on how to use the American Periodical Series and some other digital databases that we had access to, as well as open educational resources like Happy Trust. APS is a great source, and I'm so grateful to have it. You can't scroll, you can't sort of replicate the experience though of scrolling through a text the way you can with Happy Trust or Google Books. And so I often offered my students multiple ways to access the same material so that they could, explore it in different ways. APS is great for targeted search, and but I felt that sometimes Hathi Trust or other places where it was easier to scroll through might be better for students. And I never send undergraduates out into the digital sphere without some kind of worksheet or way of organizing their material. So I worked with Larry Eames on this, and I actually sort of stepped back and let Larry create the worksheet that we used to get them started with APS. So that was what we did. And for Poe, for my Poe section, we took a look at, this is just copied out of my digital, out of the learning management system, but we read The Telltale Heart, and so I linked out to it as it appeared in the Pioneer using APS. I also linked it out in Hathi Trust. And then I linked it to Jeffrey Savoy's fabulous eapo.org in case they wanted to read it that way. So they had multiple ways of accessing the same text in order to start to think about what it looked like in its print culture context. We also read the Usher in the context of Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, and so the same kind of thing happened there. And I also had students read scholarship about scholars looking at the works we were reading in their 19th century American print culture context so that they could see how scholars did that. So we used, in this case, J. Gerald Kennedy's wonderful essay in Edgar Allan Poe and 20 Objects from the Susan Jaffe Teen collection. And so that provided a model for thinking about works in their print culture context. And students did discussion questions. This is just one of several questions that the students did. And then there was an online discussion board where they could talk to each other about thinking about print culture. And some of the papers that I got, these are like some of the papers that I got in the class where students decided to write about Poe. And Poe, of course, is a popular topic to write about. One of the things that came up is that students were very interested in mental health issues, and so what I did with their papers is they wrote them in 2 drafts, and I did one-on-one paper conferences with them where I shared my screen with them, and we actually went into the database and started to do some preliminary research because some of them did it more easily than others. But I worked with them on that, and for example, many were interested in the question of mental illness, but of course, mental illness was not the term used in Poe's day, so we brainstormed for that, and then we searched, American periodical series for, monomania and that sort of thing, or words that were more common in Poe's day, so that they could do a research paper placing, The Telltale Heart in its print culture context, and so that was pretty successful. And then I had the opportunity this spring to teach a Poe seminar, which I hadn't taught in a few years. And we also used American periodical series, but one of the really important works there was the eapo.org site, Jeffrey Savoy's Labor of Love. That is an invaluable digital resource made even more valuable with the closures of libraries and book sharing resources due to the pandemic. So as I said, I do teach at a small regional university in the Western US whose library has no pretensions to excellence in the area of humanities. And in fact, it's decided that it focuses more on social science. And it sees itself as maintaining a strong collection in that area. To make up for gaps in English and literature, the library does take part in a book sharing consortium all the way up and down the Front Range, but that was shut down during the pandemic. And in fact, just getting into the library itself, for a while the library was completely closed. Then it opened up under strict limits. So, my students needed to write research papers, they needed to do their work, but there were some real limits, and I couldn't be more grateful to eapo.org. So in my seminar, I do assign a book, although many of the students they like audio and they like to listen to the audio of things. But I do assign the Library of America College Edition because it is a terrific bang for the buck, I think, but it doesn't have Mabbitt's notes. And so what I do is I assign out of that work, and then I link out to eapo.org. So very early on in the class, we start thinking about Poe in terms of print culture, and one of the assignments is to take a look at to find some Poe in the wild, right? To go out and look at a 19th century magazine and find work by Poe and look at the sort of whole picture. So who are some of the other authors? Do you recognize them? What are the other topics? Is Poe, or like other writers or different from them? And so I link out using APS, but also HathiTrust, or Google Books, so that students can have different ways of accessing that material, and they work in small groups and work together and present on what they find. When I was teaching in person, we did that by getting a computer lab and going in and sitting around and doing it, but we also did it on Zoom in small groups when I taught remotely. And then another thing that I do very early in my Poe seminars, have students start to work with Poe's letters, and I focus, because it's a somewhat chronological class, we start with the letters to John Allan, and again, we're heavy users of eapo.org. So, I send my students with a little bit of a worksheet to think about some questions about the letters, and they report on what they find. And they're looking at everything from the tone of the letters to the address of the letters to the style of the letters. And I found that is a wonderful way to introduce students to the kind of conflicts that Poe faced in his life. And they are actually very they tend to be kind of strict and judgmental readers of Poe in these letters, more than I think I am. But having access to the letters is a fabulous way, I think, of drawing them in. And I don't, because of eapo.org, I don't have to make them go to the library and check out the 2008 edition, but they can use eapo.org. And again, they have a worksheet to do that. And so, like, here's an example of when we start out, we're looking at Poe's early poetry. They're reading it in the edition that I assigned, the Library of America edition, but I have it linked out to Mabbitt using eapo.org. And then students talk about, they start reading Mabbitt's notes, and as we get into the class, they'll talk about, oh, well, Mabbitt says this and Mabbitt says that. And then this is another example of students working in small groups, looking at Poe's early satires and parodies in the context in which they appeared, using both open educational resources and eapo.org. These are some of the questions that I ask them when they go out there, because I don't want them having to go into cyberspace without any kind of structure. So there are questions that they can ask, and they work together in groups to do that. And we continue throughout the class looking at letters. So this is the letter where Poe proposes marriage to Virginia. We also look at the original letter in Poe's handwriting that we can see through the Baltimore Free Public Library. They have that digitized. And then students report on different letters that they look at, and it's another way of getting a handle on what Poe was going through at any given time when we're reading his work. So this is just another example. When we're looking at William Wilson, we use eapo.org. Here we can link out to, this links out, I think, to Gutenberg and other sites where we can read the stories that Poe critiques Hawthorne about, and then we can go back to eapoe.org and read the reviews that Poe wrote of Hawthorne around the same time that he's doing William Wilson. And then again, we're looking at the letters using eapoe.org, this time Poe's letters to Irving and Irving's response. We do some theoretical readings as well. So we're looking at the uncanny, Freud's essay on the uncanny when we're doing that. And that's a screen there. These are student written discussion prompts that they did. My students told me loud and clear in this particular class they did not want to do online discussions. They wanted to do in-person synchronous discussions. So what I had them do was come up with their, they worked in groups to come up with questions, and then we did discussions on Zoom, both in small groups and as a whole. And they were, according to their student reviews, they were very happy with that and pleased to be able to do that. Again, they write their papers in 2 drafts, and I conference with them individually on their drafts. We share screens, we do research together, and I think that helps to create community and create a personalized sense in the class, even if it is delivered remotely. And then these are just examples of things. So when we read the Goldbug and the Purloined Letter, we're looking at the W.B. Tyler letter, which we can do through eapoe.org. I also link out to, this is a little clip from the letter off of Google Books in Graham's magazine, or we're talking about secret writing. So, I can link out to Poe's Valentine to Francis Sargent Osgood. So they have it in their book, but they also have it, they can also look at it as it appeared in Graham's. And then finally, I'm closing with some images that my students do presentations on their paper before they submit the final draft. And this is a student's picture of her own edits in the book. She was writing on Alone and also on the lake, and she shared that, and I just thought that was so wonderful that she did that. Although now that Susan has shared the hypothesis.is software, maybe we'll start using that. But I show this to show that I think our students and I teach at a school with almost 25% students experience food insecurity at some time. We have a high level of Pell eligible students. Many do use university provided Chromebooks for their schoolwork, or try to do it on their phone. But at the same time, this is a student who's preparing to be a secondary education teacher. I have quite a few students who are doing that, and they like some of the old-fashioned. So even though we teach online and use all kinds of digital resources, there's something really special about the handwritten. And I really appreciated the student who shared this. And I think our students, they liked the in-person discussion, even though it was mediated through Zoom, and they like taking their notes this way. So I thought I would end with just a little, even though our students are supposed to be digital natives, I think they also really have a special feeling for some of the old school ways of teaching as well. So I will stop sharing here, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Lesley. Thank you very much for all 4 presenters, Susan, Helciclever, Les, and Lesley. And now we can open it up for questions. We've got more or less like 20 minutes for questions for those of you who want to ask our presenters. I would, like, as the president has said, please raise your hand like this, or with the icon of raising the hand, so we can go one by one. So I saw Jacqueline's hand first, then I saw Alexander's, and then Jeff. So let's go in that order. Jacqueline first.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed very much all of the presentations, and my question is for Liz Harrison. So I also like to consider myself a digital humanist or a digital humanist to be very soon. I'm also working on digital editing with Edgar Allan Poe's Writings of Terror with TEI. So my question is about the teaching and learning of TEI. So I was wondering if the students are learning TEI at the same time as they are studying Poe, or if it is part of, if it's in different departments, because here I'm doing my PhD in an English department. So all the TEI and digital editing stuff, I need to basically hunt somewhere else. So I was wondering how that would work there. And I apologize if you already answered this, but my internet was a little bit unstable. Thank you.
Thanks. What I have them do is they do it at the same time. They're reading Poe, and then the last half of the seminar, you know, our evening seminars here start at 7, so they go 7 to 9:40. And for that last half, you've just got to have them do something active, because they just hit the wall, right? Particularly around 9 o'clock. So I had them doing activities. I relied a lot on TEI.org and teach yourself TEI. There's so many, you know, little videos out there and whatnot. Once they get over I mean, it's intimidating, I think, when somebody first looks at it if you don't know anything about it. But once you get your head around, it's really not that hard. And they come around the fact that it's funny, they said they were doing fine, and then when it was time to put the additions, I got all the panic emails about, like, it's throwing an error and I can't make the error go away. But I think that's going to happen no matter what, right? Like, you think you know it until you're up against a deadline and you can't get the error to go away. So yeah, I tried to do a little bit of A, a little bit of B as I went, make sure they're learning as they go. And I came up with a couple of little assignments, like they had to get me one witness, like 3 weeks out, one witness that validated. And unfortunately, Juxta's gone now, but they had to come up with a Juxta collation set for me. So.
Yes, and oxygen, I think you mentioned as well, and it helps a lot as well. But it can cause panic with all the errors, but it's really
that interface is just, and I keep trying to find something better than oxygen, and I keep coming back to it. There's some people trying to get everybody to use Sublime, and then they stopped updating it. Oh no, Atom. It was Atom. There was somebody that was like, I'm moving my students to Atom, and then Atom got bought by GitHub, and now it isn't updated anymore. So at least Oxygen updates all the time.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
Very good. So next in line was Alexander Hammond.
Thank you. This is for Susan. Susan, just struck by a student demographic that's 73% below the poverty line. I'm just curious about access. What kind of ways do these students have of getting access to online environments, to any adequate digital computers? How do you work with that?
You're muted.
Pre-pandemic, there were 40-something computer labs on the campus, and students made use of those to do it. When the pandemic hit, as I said, most of them were not ready for it. And the university was extremely slow in getting to them, as you know, Les pointed out, Chromebooks. And they finally got Chromebooks to, I believe, to most of the students that needed. But it was the semester was, as anybody who taught then can attest, a bit of a mess because students couldn't hand in assignments. They asked if they could hand in, you know, handwritten assignments. And so that's what they've done because they couldn't even go to their public libraries. So it was a struggle for some of them to complete the class, although I gave them a lot of leeway on that.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Very good. So our next question was from Jeff Savoy.
I actually have two questions. One is a very simple one for Les. And a more complicated one, I think I'll probably ask them both at the same time and answer them in this order. I noticed, Les, when you were showing the Spirits of the Dead little mock-up that they had done that said, Poe changed gray to gray, Poe did this, Poe did that. I wonder if your students are really aware of the editorial intercession of people other than Poe in his texts. I'll let you answer that question before I ask my big one then. Oh, you are also.
Every time. We discuss it in class, but I had them write it as Poe. That's the short answer for that. You know, we did discuss, you know, and that it's hard to know what was a voluntary versus involuntary, what was house style, without getting your actual hands on the document.
And then what Poe ultimately accepted as opposed to what, you know, maybe he kind of had to take. But
yeah.
So my broader question was partly inspired by what Lesley was showing us with the book with all of the little pieces of paper in it. Well, a conference I went to some years ago, there was a presentation specifically on digital in the classroom in a broader sense than Poe, obviously. And I was surprised to find out several of the presenters said that they were already experiencing a student backlash against being all digital. In particular, students really seemed to be objecting to Google campuses. That was beginning to be a big thing at the time, that Google seemed to be taking over their lives, and they weren't really very happy about that. I kind of wonder, in doing this, you know, now we've been forced with Zoom, you've done a whole year of this, you know, completely digital. Are you finding that there really is a backlash? Is it worse? Is it better? Are you going to adopt some of this stuff when you still go back into the classroom?
I'm going to get one thing on the table there, and then I'll back off because I've already talked a bit. And it is that I have them do commonplace books, right? You know, reading journals, but they don't even have to lead in. You just jam down a quote and then say a thing or two about it or hashtag it. And they much prefer that, and have for about 7 years, prefer that to be buy a notebook and do it rather than go online and do it. Now, the cynic in me says that's because doing it at home on paper means there's no time date stamp of when they actually did the entries. But I do think some of it is that it's less of a dog and pony show. You're reading, you've got a little notebook next to you. It's more convenient.
Well, I might say that I think it's really mixed, and that even some of the same students who say, oh, I really miss face-to-face, on the other hand, there are students, you know, the majority of them are working more than 40 hours a week. You know, many of them really, they like the convenience of online and digital access. And even in face-to-face classrooms, we have all of our classrooms have a computer podium and a screen, and we look at digital images and all kinds of things like that when we're in the classroom. So I actually think that the digital has so much to offer as long as we can maintain. I do think it's important to have some kind of sense of community within the classroom. And I did notice when I was taking a class about teaching online that it's very easy to feel separate and distant. And I think, you know, as long as we can maintain some of those kind of connections, that actually does facilitate student learning. And, you know, back when I was a graduate student, I thought, oh, that kind of, you know, soft stuff is so ridiculous. But now that I'm older, I actually feel that there's an importance to that, and yet one can do that through a variety of different mediums. And, you know, you can feel isolated in a crowd in person, or you can feel connected online, depending on how you know, the medium is used, I would say.
Very good. So I see Travis' hand is up. So do you want to go ahead, Travis?
Sure. I have a question for Helciclever. So I was amazed to hear about the sheer number of Raven translations produced in Brazil. I wanted to know, were most of those translations made in the 19th century or in the 20th?
19th century, 20th century, in 20th century, yes, all the centuries.
It's just been perennially popular in Brazil.
Yes, very popular.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to know, does anyone else have any other questions? Alexander Hammond, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
My apologies. Clearly this session teaches you to unmute yourself. One of the things that really struck me about this sense of clearly this concern and immersion of Poe's text in a print culture and all that implies. One thing I've done just in following people like Brian and Fluent Text things is wonder in terms of Poe himself. That is that the print culture is so rich and but Poe's particular world obviously had no access to the kind of digital things. When he had access, it was as a reviewer, as a journalist, all of this material sort of pouring in. How do you have a sense of just how Poe's mind worked in terms of himself being caught in that environment? Now, obviously, there's things like excellent paragraph and so forth, but just in a day-to-day world, how does he hold together all of that massive material that's coming in? And you have any sense of not just dissolving Poe, as sometimes I think he does, not just dissolving him into that world. How does he manage it as it's flooding in at him? I'll just stop at that. This is an interesting silence.
Well, there is that terrific quote about how, you know, Poe sees the age as the age of the magazine. And, you know, and I mean, he's so interested in that. And I mean, I think that's where I would go, at least with students. You know, granted, there's not the digital. And, you know, I'm actually very interested in handwriting cultures and manuscript cultures. But you know, I mean, I think he for him, I tell my students it was like the internet of his day. Right, that's what the magazine was like, and that everybody, just like people have their blogs, you know, everybody wanted a magazine. He wanted a magazine, and I try to approach it in that way because I think he was very interested in it as a medium.
You know, I would add in stuff about maybe I've been assigning a lot more anastatic printing. I think that talks to the moment. Well, you know, what I wanted to say in response to your question of how did he manage it, you know, I kept not wanting to come back to that T.W. White quote where it's like, oh, I don't think he read most of the books, which is at least worth putting out there and thinking about how we read in magazines versus how we read in novels. You know, there's a big movement to ditch Times New Roman. You know, I do some stuff with tech writing and legal writing, and like there's a bunch of people in the legal profession that are ditch Times New Roman because it's made to read newspapers, and you don't read that with attention the way you should read a legal brief. You should find something different, something that, you know, is not for light reading.
I guess I just remind you of Griswold sneering at Poe's material, I think most presumably out of that trunk, in which he suggested Poe kept track of everything that was said about him. And I don't recall, and how Poe, what Griswold is looking at to say that, I guess, obviously refer to Jeff or things like that, but I just have the sense that that Poe was not just a skimmer and a dabbler. There was something just absolutely, I don't know, have an absolute in there. It's a question I've been working with in part because I'm working with all this sort of source material about another obsessed reader of Holt. Anyhow, any other thoughts people have about how Poe either both managed it and kept it going? Because he kept it going sometimes without magazines to draw on. He kept it going sometimes without without money. Anyhow, I'll stop.
That I think is super interesting. And I think about Poe selling his books too. Like he's like the opposite of Everett Dykink, right? Who had, you know, the best library in New York, but never produced anything, right? Like, I think there is something to him selling his books and like just knowing he could trust his head. You know, like, I know I think about the weirdness of academics. Like we all have tons of books, but most of us have an office within walking distance of a library. So like, why do we need, you know, the 9th copy of Poe's Collected Tales that we have on the...
Of course, for Poe, that was one of the side benefits of being a reviewer. You got the material for free and you could sell it afterwards, and he did, which is why he did not write marginal notes in his books.
Some books contain marginalia, Jeff, though, right?
There are a few books that he, well, there are a few books that he was given mostly. So they were already inscribed to him. So that kind of hurt the ability to resell them.
Well, Tresh mentions the annotations in his volume of Chambers's book on natural theology. And apparently this copy is in the Ransom Center and it contains a lot of marginalia from Poe. That's not common, but apparently there's at least one text that is heavily annotated that is extant.
I have to admit, I'm not actually sure I'm familiar with that. I'd be interested in knowing more about that.
I'd never heard about it before reading Tresh's book, but there's a footnote in which he's talking about Poe's readings in natural theology, and he mentions this book being in the collection of the Ransom Center. So I have some reading to do myself.
Very good. So we've got time for another question. If anyone wants to go ahead.
Are we done with textbooks? Is everything just going to be, you know, buying online texts and looking at online resources? Certainly 19th century stuff is widely available.
One thing there, go ahead.
We're not done with, we're not done with textbooks because the textbook companies won't let us be done with them, but I myself am done with them. I wouldn't use a textbook again, although I get, I'm sure everybody does in your email, offers for textbook. They're priced for students, but for me, when, especially 19th century, when it's available online, I won't even have them buy a grammar textbook, really nothing. So for me, the textbook is dead. Open educational resources for everybody.
I'll add to that so many, you know, I agree with everything you said there, Susan. The thing that gets me a little bit angry is that our library and our university are pushing so much for like, yeah, we've got to get those educational textbook costs down. And it's like, yeah, those are high, but I think there's someplace else we could realize a bigger savings. The textbooks aren't the thing. They're just the thing that you don't control, right?
I asked my online students how they like to read because I was expecting them to say that they wanted everything online because, you know, I do notice, you know, year after year, fewer students are buying the textbook and they're using online sources. And yet when you ask them, they say, I had a pretty strong contingent who said they like having the text in their hand. And I was surprised actually, because I know that they're using audiobooks. And I was delighted to hear that Susan was saying that she has them read and listen at the same time, because from what I've seen in the research, that's where the comprehension happens, when you're listening and reading. But I don't know. It's really hard. I think it's harder to make a blanket statement. And I wasn't looking for a particular answer from them or anything. They were talking to each other really about their preferences, and I was very surprised at the number who said that they wanted a hard copy text when I taught my very first class with no hard copy text at all. And some of them said they printed things out, and so it was surprising to me.
I should say that I do offer a textbook of sorts in, in a PDF format. It's on Blackboard, and if students would prefer the hard copy, it's fine by me if they want to print it out. But as I said, I won't have them buy any textbooks.
With what Lesley was saying about, it is surprising. Like there's a colleague of mine here who's a fairly popular teacher, and he has this policy that if you bring a laptop to class, you have to sit in one of the back rows. And the students love it because they've talked to them about how, like, yeah, you'll be lecturing and I'll be watching somebody I don't know's Facebook feed over their shoulder because of like that power of the screen to grab you. I think if every teacher did it, they'd get pissed about it though, right?
Very good. So I don't know if we have time for one more question. Amy, what do you think? Yes. Okay. So Alexander.
Just really for Lesley, are struck by the wonderful image of the student taking the Library of America text and putting all these annotations on it. And my question really came back to Poe. Marginalia has the sort of pretense of Poe being a version of Dyke Ink, of having the money to own exotic text and writing all these things out on the margins. I guess part of my question would be faking it. That is, to the extent to which you pretend to be a reader with a physical text who can afford to mark up books. And I guess I would come back to, is the student doing something like that?
Well, I would say in this particular case, this is a student who wants to go into education. So they're their own group, the ones who are studying to be high school teachers, middle school and high school teachers. I used to go into the classroom with my textbook and show the students physically my notes because I think it's really important to be an engaged reader. But as I think Susan's presentation showed us, there's lots of digital ways that you can be an engaged reader. You don't have to write in the books. And many of my students, just like Poe, would write their things on sticky notes because they wanted to resell the book at the end of the semester, and you can sell it for more if there aren't notes in it. So I think being flexible about being an engaged reader is important. Just like I had to. I give quizzes in my undergraduate classes, which is something I never did. My students asked me to do it, so I started to do it. I had never seen a quiz. And then with teaching online, I had to completely rethink what a quiz was. I actually made my quizzes, I gave them the full week to take a quiz, and I asked the kind of questions where I was encouraging them to look up the answer. And they could find out if they didn't answer something correctly, they could go back to the text and figure out how to answer something correctly. And my students said that it took the pressure off of it because, the point of it was to increase awareness and comprehension, right? Not to get this or that score. And theoretically, I wanted every student to get the best possible score. I think being flexible in how we promote engaged reading is very important. But I'm very concerned about reading and our students' abilities to read 19th century texts. They love Poe, but the language is difficult for them. How do we encourage retention? How do we encourage engagement, close reading? right? I mean, I think those skills are incredibly important, and I don't want to lose them, but we can be flexible about how we approach teaching those.
And you're not playing Poe as policeman of other people's reading. I mean, that's one of the things he does and loves to do it.
Well, and he's good at it, but he's also wrong, you know, and like he makes mistakes. He was wrong about Hawthorne, right? And you know, and the whole plagiarism thing is terrific. That teaches so well for students, you know. So I think you know, there are fun ways to approach it, I think, and you know, I think that the students come away with a much richer sense of Poe when we can show what happens in a digital environment, and we're not limited to a textbook.
You know, they relate too to, like, you know, with you were saying the letter Poe wrote and then republished, right? You know, I mean, that's they have a word for that now, right? That's sock puppeting, because it's a hallmark of online, you know, message boards and what, like, oh look, all of a sudden somebody agrees with me, right?
Well, thank you, everybody. We have to wrap it up here. So thanks to all the presenters, all those who came to the session.